I'm Jenny Fern, and welcome to my library. I am a chaotic neutral mechanical engineer who's really into permaculture and wants to talk about books. So let's talk about books. Today, I have my February reading wrap-up. It is just about mid-February now. I must retrieve my notebook. I will be right back. Sometimes I have unintentional themes for the month, and I think this month, kind of one of my themes would be short stories. I've been reading a lot of them. The first thing that I finished reading this month was this issue of poetry. This is volume 213, number 5. I love this cover, and it was selected for the Books and Lala cover challenge for this year for the word pattern. So that's why it was on my TBR, and I have not sat down and read an issue of this ever in my life, even though I have maybe 6 or 7 now. I had such a great time. I didn't enjoy all of the poems, but some of them I enjoyed to a great degree. I also found inspiration in some lines of the poetry for short fiction, which was wonderful. I would like to read one poem for you today because it was my favorite. I thought it was beautiful. It is called Dictionary of Owl by Mary Merriam. Who cares about the redwood tree? Its flowers half black, half pink from winter's April freeze. Who cares who lives halfway or dies too soon? The blue jay's baby squirming on bare ground, the agonies of blood, the frigid breeze, shaking the fragile scents of April showers. Who cares who craves the heated pools of June, the lake of boaters buzzing by or drowned? 2 vultures meet me at my open door, scanning for carrion, the stink of spasms, the sky gods pecking rotting flesh for food. Who cares if this strange order ends in good, or if the chickadee lands in the chasms of endless carelessness forevermore? I love that. Reading it back, I'm like, oh, okay, I understand that it sounds kind of macabre, but I feel like it's not. I really enjoyed my experience reading this, and like I said again, there were some poems that I was super not connected with, some that I was. Overall, I didn't regret any moment of reading this. Here's a line from a poem called The Unauthorized Autobiography of Young Thug by Courtney Lamar Charleston. I think it's Young Thug. It's spelled with a J, so maybe it's Young Thug. I truly went ass first into fronting indifference, forbade my happy teeth from public reveal lest they pop the balloon of my perfectly round face. Baby angeled, already read as kind or innocent or soft from the jump when I wanted respect on my name and women on my lap like it was said I should. So beautiful. I recommend you read some poetry if you don't usually, like I don't. The next book that I read was Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. This was a reread that I've been wanting to do since last year, and I finally got to it. This was a book that was required reading for me when I was maybe a freshman in high school, if not middle school. It's funny how vivid the remembrance of this book is. It's such a book that sticks with you because it is a little traumatic. There's like stuff that as a kid you're like, what the hell's going on, teacher? And then your teacher's like, okay, let me explain the glove. Let me explain, like, the prostitution. But this, gosh, what really got me now as an adult reading this was how close and far away their dream is. George and Lenny are farm workers in California, and they have been traveling from farm to farm for their lodging and work. And Lenny is a man with an intellectual disability, and he is being cared for by George, who is his cousin, after Lenny's aunt has died. Lenny has gotten himself into trouble in the past because he is very strong, but he can panic and do the wrong thing. There is so much foreshadowing in this book. You kind of get an idea of what's going to happen as you're seeing the like smaller versions of that happen earlier on in the book. Yeah, what really struck me this read through was they're so close to achieving their goal, which is their own plot of land where Lenny can tend to rabbits and where they can do the farm work for themselves. Because obviously they can do farm work. They do it all the time, and they do it for measly pay that just runs through their fingers. And it felt like such a reflection of being a worker, especially like at this time and with these conditions where you work all day, hard labor, and then you just can't save the money. I love John Steinbeck as an author, and I highly recommend people read him. This one is maybe not what I would recommend people start with. I love, personally, Cannery Row. I think Cannery Row is an excellent, excellent John Steinbeck to start with. So my library had an article sent out through their email, which was about Native American books to read. And I jotted a whole bunch of them down, but one of them that really caught my attention was a collection of short stories called The Forgetters by Greg Saris. This book is so unique because it really focuses on this very specific area and the stories that have been passed along by the indigenous people in the Coast Miwok and Pomo territories, or whatever regions. So these are the stories, and each of them are like bookended by a conversation between two crows, one who is the questioner and one who is the answerer. And I loved that framework of just like having a couple of crows walk you through like these stories and the concept of telling stories and keeping and saving stories that are indigenous. So here's a list of stories. A boy opens the clouds. Dissenters find a stranger in their camp. A man follows an osprey. A woman meets an owl, a rattlesnake, and a hummingbird in Santa Rosa. Meadowlark haunts a Chilean man. A man shoots his stepfather. A woman invents a lover. A man learns to smell flowers. A girl sees a giant sturgeon. The people on Sonoma Mountain have a storytelling contest. It was just so cool. It was just so cool, again, to read stories set in such a small place that are really, really rooted in being passed down. Some of them are not quite that old. Some of them are from like the 1940s. Gosh, it was so interesting hearing the historical perspective of this region because being from California, I think of like the history of California. You kind of think of it starting as like the gold rush, because that's what's pertinent to it being a part of the United States. You don't really think of California being a place the entire time. My favorite stories, A Man Follows an Osprey. I was locked in for that. I loved that story. And A Man Shoots His Stepfather, I also was really into. And the last story, The People on Sonoma Mountain Have a Storytelling Contest, was the coolest concept, in my opinion. It is set in the future, and I loved it. I loved that. I thought it was so cool. A really novel reading experience for me. I highly recommend that you find, if possible, indigenous authors from wherever you are and read from them. So if that's available and possible for you, I highly recommend it. And I also recommend that you use your local library system, because I never would have heard of this book if it weren't for the emails that I get from my library. Now this one is very, very controversial, and I fully understand that. I had this on my TBR at the beginning of the year for the Books in Lala cover challenge for a weapon on the cover. And since then, I have found out that the author has had really terrible accusations of rape and other abuses. Like really evil bad guy shit. But I did already have this book and I did read it. Gosh, I don't know if there's any other way. Once you find out some heinous stuff about an author, how do you read their work without it changing how you would have read the work? So I'm talking about Norse mythology. I definitely was affected by the news about Neil Gaiman. It's genuinely such a shame because I have read his other works. I have a section on my bookshelf of Neil Gaiman work. He was never a favorite author, but he was like a solid, reliable, good read author. I'm just obviously incredibly upset that he has decided to just be a disgusting person. So that's how I feel about it. This book itself, I got this as a gift from my dad. He read it and he thought it was really good, so he gave it to me. That was several years ago. It was okay. This is all about Norse mythology, so the mythology of the Norse gods. Some of it was a little confusing, to be honest. The beginning, like setting up what the different types of people are. There's like giants and there's like certain types of gods and other types of gods. And like the world and the names for the different parts of the world. I don't know what it was, but I feel like that could have gone a little bit, I feel like it was like a little flowery for me, especially considering most of the rest of the work is very like, it's almost like crass in how it's written. So the beginning, the opening of like this kind of magical world, the creation myth, I thought that was one of the most compelling images, but the different people and the different places, I feel like it was a little too brief. And maybe that's just because it's not really that important for the rest of the work. This is a series of short stories, a series of different myths. Some of them build on each other, especially in terms of the characters. I am familiar only a little bit about Norse mythology through the Marvel characters, Thor and Loki. That's really my only exposure. It is mentioned in the beginning of that book that that's the author's initial exposure as well. And I actually feel like, and who knows, because I haven't read the source material, but I feel like the depictions of Loki and Thor's personalities in the Marvel series is at least aligned with this work. It feels very similar. So I like couldn't help but compare this to my reading experience of Pearl and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Especially comparing this to like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. The storytelling of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight was so mysterious and lush, and I really felt transported, whereas with this, I just was not enjoying myself. I had a really hard time sinking into a scene, and I don't know, I just felt like there was some element of it being underwritten, and maybe that's just because we were getting to the core of the story. The story isn't about the ambiance, the story is just about these dastardly little deeds of Loki or some trickery or you know, they're kind of like plot driven. So overall, I did not enjoy my time with this. I did not grasp a ton of what was happening. I had a hard time sinking into this story. So only some of the stories I really sunk into, and some of them just kind of floated past me. I don't have a problem admitting that. Like, can I consider that I really read this book? I got through it, is how I'll put it. I will consider that I have now read this book, and was it worth my time? That's questionable. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. Especially after hearing about the author, it made it very difficult to read this without thinking that it was a shit book written by a shit guy. So I'll be completely honest. I read Frieren Volume 11. I love Frieren. I think it's an excellent manga. It's also an excellent anime. If you want to explore that, it's about an elf who is very, very old, and she went on this formative expedition with a D&D adventuring party when she was younger, still very old. And there are like echoes of that expedition with what she's doing now with a new party. And I think there's just really beautiful explorations of like basically humanity. And I thought it's just a lovely story. Mashal Volume 3. I've been reading Mashal, Magic and Muscles, which is a manga featuring this guy who is very ordinary. He's kind of dumb and he works out a lot. He is extremely extraordinary in his physical abilities, but he lives in a magical world where if you are not a magical person, you are sentenced to death. And so he is trying to prove his worth in a magic school, trying to blend in, even though he has no magical abilities. It is Harry Potter fanfiction, and I love it. I love his ability to make friends out of his enemies. I think that is such a charming element of that story, and the friendship is really what I come back for. I just finished reading the first volume of Saving 80,000 Gold in Another World for my retirement. This was a book that I sampled when I was reading your manga suggestions, and the sample was quite short. I recommended that my library get it, and they did, and I was able to read the first volume. But unfortunately, it did not completely resonate with me. It was a little weird. Here's why I think it's a little weird. It's got some really strong like capitalist vibes. Like she is trying to make money and she is exploiting what she has, what her ability is, which is basically teleportation, to try to make money. But it's because her whole family has died. And so she really needs to take care of herself. She's really worried about her future. I think just the tail end of this, I was like, the whole time I was like, I don't think this is for me. I don't know. But then that last issue, I'm like, ooh, maybe I do read the next volume and give it another shot. So I was able to read a book this month from NetGalley. And this one, I was so thrilled that they allowed me to review this book. That is The Dilemmas of Working Women by Fumio Yamamoto. And I also read at the back of the book, the very back of this book explains a little bit about the context of the original work, because this is the English translation. The original work was published in Japanese in 2000, and it still feels so fresh and modern. The context was basically economic difficulties or a recession in Japan. And so just like thinking a lot about work, having financial problems, and the struggles of being a working adult are really present in this set of stories. So this was translated from the Japanese by Brian Bergstrom. I was able to read this from NetGalley, from the publisher Harper Via. And I'm so grateful, again, super grateful that I was able to access this book. This will be released in August 11th, 2025. Because this is a book that requires reviewing as a part of like the trade, it's an exchange. I get to read the book, I get access to the book before it's published, and I exchange a review for that access. So because that's a part of the deal, I, of course, did have to review this book. I did post it on Goodreads, and I did give it a star rating, even though I'm not doing that for all of my personal reading this year. I gave this 5 stars, and I know I've mentioned before, I will give something 5 stars on NetGalley, even if it doesn't personally resonate with me, if I can't find anything wrong with it. And for this book, this one struck me very personally, and I loved it. So I loved this book, and I suppose I can read my rating to all of you, or my review to all of you right now. The Dilemmas of Working Women is a collection of 5 stories about Japanese women and men living their lives, working their jobs, and facing their internal and external worlds. It was first published in Japanese in 2000 and has now been translated to English but these stories felt as relevant as ever to me. These stories explore the mundanity of adult life and the lost feelings one can have when things aren't quite going well. Planarian and Here Which Is Nowhere were my favorite stories. The former is about a woman struggling to want to work after surviving breast cancer, still feeling the health and mental effects of that endeavor, while her family doesn't understand why she isn't acting like she's better yet. The latter is about a mother whose children are outright avoiding her and who has taken up night shifts at a local store to help keep their family afloat financially. These stories capture a very real feeling of the arbitrary callousness and everyday pains of living in our modern society that one becomes exposed to once entering the working world. There is a line in the back of the book where some commentary is offered that perfectly explains the enchantment these stories have. This writing beguiles us into total sympathy with her characters, even as she allows us to view them critically as well. The characters may do things you would never do, but you feel like you understand how they got there and why they made that choice. A genuinely lovely reading experience, one that I was so grateful to have had. I recommend this book to any working adult. So, as you can see, high praise. I loved this reading experience. There were 5 short stories. I did mention my favorites were Planarian and Here Which Is Nowhere. Here Which Is Nowhere was so impactful to me because it's about this woman, like I mentioned, it's about this woman who is taking care of her household. Her children are like young adult to teenage, and they are not talking to her. She's really worried about them, especially her daughter. Her daughter isn't coming home at night. She doesn't know what she's getting up to. Anytime she tries to talk to her daughter just is super shut to her. And she is taking these night shifts at a local market. And so she, after dinner, her kids, say terrible things to her or whatever. She rides this bicycle. She's like riding this bicycle in the pouring rain. And then she's like a minute late. And she's been a minute late twice in a row. And 3 late shifts, and you don't get paid. And it is horrifying. It is horrifying because it is so realistic. I was a teenager during the recession, and this just felt so real to me. And she is taking these shifts to try to add to their funds as a family because her husband, his pay has been cut like in half, and she has to tell her kids that they can't afford college and all of this stuff. So anyway, just that story alone is like worth the 5 stars. That was such an impactful story. But the very first story that I read in this collection, I was like, wow, this is amazing. And then I read the second story, which was Planarian, and I was like, this is stunning. And then I read the third story, which was my favorite of the bunch. And anyway, I loved this collection. I highly recommend that you go buy this when it's available, especially if you are a working adult. I feel like, especially the last couple years, I was incredibly unhappy with my job. Like every single day I was unhappy, and it maybe if you haven't gone through this, you won't be able to relate to some of the feelings in this book. And maybe if you're still in that situation, luckily I'm outside of that situation now. I actually do enjoy what I'm doing now. So good. Super good writing. Just the empathy. Oh, it's good. It's good shit. Would like to mention what I have read from this collection so far as well. Since last month, I read the short story As Is by Robert Silverberg. This is about a magical car that's been purchased. And then The Cloak by Robert Bloch, which is about a magical cloak that has been purchased. As you can imagine, Magic for Sale is about the buying and selling of magical items. I enjoyed both of those stories quite a lot. I have been reading The Shining by Stephen King. I have been reading this through an audiobook rental from my library, and I have been loving it. The Shining is one of my favorite movies. My bathroom has been styled in homage to The Shining, the bathroom in The Shining. And so it has that like green paint, and then it has a gold shower curtain. It does not look like the bathroom in The Shining. I do not have a fancy house. But anyway, so The Shining means a lot to me, but I've never read it before. I did read Stephen King's criticism of the movie The Shining. He famously does not like the movie adaptation of The Shining. And from what I've read, I'm 3/4 of the way through this book. I think the movie does a beautiful job. And granted, I love the movie, but I think considering you cannot put all of this into the movie does a really, really wonderful job of incorporating a lot of the material from the book. And I have to say, there's some stuff in the book that I think is kind of stupid. One of the things that I think is kind of dumb about this book is there's like an entire chapter where he's just reading newspaper clippings, and we read with him those newspaper clippings. Boy howdy, do we spend an entire chapter reading newspaper clippings about the hotel. There's so much more background and context about Jack Torrance. There is so much about his personal background, his family background. There's so much more about the abuses that he has enacted. So much more about his alcoholism than I think is portrayed in the movie. He is a recovering alcoholic. He has a history of violence. And Stephen King's criticism of the movie of The Shining is that they don't portray enough of the complexities of Jack, and I guess he put a lot of himself into this book. Like a lot of his experiences with alcoholism and his experiences with like, I don't know if he was a violent person or what, but like a lot of himself is in this book. So he has taken it a bit personally, but he thinks that the movie doesn't portray Jack as complex as he is. And I don't know, Jack is complex. He's very struggling. He's very violent, and he has a lot of problems. And I think the movie portrays that quite well. And of course he has good intentions. I feel like you can get that from the movie, but that was one of the problems. The other problem that Stephen King had was that Wendy didn't seem as complex to him. And I just disagree, because Wendy doesn't seem very complex in the book, like to me at all. Now, the thing that I think the book really, really adds is this deep theme around abuse and cycles of abuse, and how childhood abuse begets more abuse. Because both Jack and Wendy have been abused. And you can really see how that affects them and their relationship with their kid. Because you get so much more background into them, you can really get the sense of how much that has affected them, and how being in this haunted hotel alone as a family really percolates those feelings and brings them to the surface in a way that cannot be ignored. And I really think that the themes of abuse are so much stronger in the book than in the movie. Loving The Shining. If you don't know what The Shining is about, it is about a family, Jack, Wendy, and their son. They go to stay at the Overlook Hotel, which is a very remote hotel that is inaccessible in the winter. In the winter, snow closes off that whole region, and they need a groundskeeper who will keep the furnaces running, keep everything maintained so that when it opens back up in the spring, everything's functioning perfectly. Their son has a special gift, which is known very early on in the story, called The Shining, where he can read people's minds, basically. He can hear people's thoughts. He can get access to this other world, really. So there's this like ghostly element, but there's also just, he has the ability to read minds. He has the ability to project into other people's minds to some extent. Now they are closed off as a family during the winter. And as I said, there's these cycles of abuse. Really having a wonderful time. The only like con I have is that unfortunately their family relationship reminds me a lot of like my childhood in like a triggering way. So I'd say that's the only thing that's like not so great, is it's just reminding me of like my own childhood traumas. The other things I want to note that I've read are 2 zines so far. I have read Meditation with Insects, An Art of Noticing. This is by Christian Breivik, and you can get this from Unfolding Connections. So yes, Meditation with Insects and A Divinity of Earwigs. I really wanted to read more diverse things. Since I'm not using a book tracking app, I am now able to feel like these things count for something. It's really like a little book, right? We can open it up and we get like a flyer of a whole bunch of quotes and information. I will be back with more updates. Until the end of the month. I read Living with Spiders. So far this is my favorite one. I loved this. It basically has more text than the others, and I love the messages. Borders and private property, cleanliness and hygiene, control of others, risk and fear. I just thought that was a really wonderful way to talk about a lot of topics that are actually very interesting, was in respect to spiders. And I haven't quite gotten to How to Love Ticks and Mosquitoes yet, but I will do that soon. So I binged a bunch of children's books last night because I picked them up from the thrift store yesterday. Little Brown Bear. This is a Little Golden book, and I adored this. I thought the story was super cute. I love the illustration style. Their house is so cozy. I love the messaging. I love that. I love how domestic it is. It's very sweet. This is by Wendy Watson. I also read this Madeline book by Ludwig Bemelmans. Never even said the author of Madeline's name before. This one is probably problematic because, I mean, it uses a slur in the title, first of all. There's a carnival that comes to town, and Madeline and her friend just basically get taken by the carnival. And then the woman who like is the main like carnival lady, she is like trying to hide them away. It's very weird, but I love the illustration style of Madeline. Like, just this, I'm like, I might need a tattoo of just this. I have been thinking about a, at least an upper arm sleeve of a bunch of literary characters. I really want an illustration from The Little Prince, and an illustration from Madeline would look so good. So there's 2 styles really. There's this like really garish style, and then we get like the very simplistic monochromatic style. And I love them both. Like, there's so much character to both of them. But the thing that I really found quite interesting that I'd never realized, I'm sure this was in all of the books when I was a kid and I just never noticed it, there is a list of scenery in the back that tells you all of the like real places in France that are pictured in Madeline. And I think that is just such a cool idea. This book is called Tree by Britta Tecklenburg. Trup. This was okay. The text of the book is quite boring. For an adult, it's just about the seasons. The exciting part of it is the scenery. Kind of, you have these like little cutouts, and so you get more and more cutouts and then less and less. And so you have like the hubbub of life during summer, and then it pares down in winter again. So that was quite fun. It's a very well-made book. It's definitely a good book for children, but for me, the art style wasn't really something that I was super interested in, and the story I wasn't super interested in either, but I definitely will put this in my little free library for some lucky kid. And then I thought this was a children's book, and I think it could, in theory, be a children's book, but it is really long. And that is All I Need to Know I Learned from My Cat by Susie Becker. It really reminded me of Al, my very needy and adventuresome cat. This page is great. So this is basically what it is. It's a series of really, really cute illustrations of living with a cat and just the dumb things that they do. This is Peak Al. Recommend this if you can get this. I have 2 more stories that I read in a Ray Bradbury collection. So I started reading this Long After Midnight collection, and I read the first 2 stories. The first one is called The Blue Bottle. This is set on Mars. It's a bit of a strange story, but I really enjoyed the ambiance. His writing is so like full. I love Ray Bradbury's writing. And then I also read One Timeless Spring, which is all about puberty. It was experimental, I would say. I also finished reading The Shining, which last I talked to you, I was about 3/4 of the way through it, and I did in fact finish it. I have to be completely honest. So I was reading this through an audiobook, and I like paused it in the middle of like the big climax, and I just didn't even realize that that's where I was. And then it all ended like immediately after I picked it back up, and I just did not realize how close to the end of this book I was at. So I may have like just missed like a little bit of the ending in the way that I had read it. Like I didn't want to go back and reread it because I was like, okay, yeah, I get what's going on. I feel like that part of the movie goes on for quite a bit longer, at least in like percentage-wise. I was pleasantly surprised by the way that this book ends. I think if you have watched the movie, you still have something to gain from reading the book. I just finished reading something moments before hitting record today, and that was this book. This is Del Universo de Isadora Moon, Mirabella y el hechizo del dragón. Mitad bruja, mitad hada, una torbellino de magia, by Harriet Muncaster. Mirabella is a half fairy, half witch. I love witches, so super into reading this. And I enjoyed the story. It is about this girl. She is half fairy and half witch. Her dad's side is fairy, her mom's side is witch. And she feels more connected to her mom's side. She feels more witch-like. She's really interested in potions and that kind of thing. Her family goes to this dance. It's like a nature dance, and her father is like, Mirabella, you gotta be on your best behavior. Today we are getting in touch with your fairy side. No magic. Like, no witch's magic. And she's like, okay, Dad, I'm just gonna bring some potions with me. And then she unleashes these nature, they're like made out of petals and sticks and leaves, these dragons into this this beautiful, like, fairy festival, and her mom have to, like, save the day. I didn't understand that I was at the end of this book either, because a significant portion of this book is, like, crafts, where in the back it has, like, recipes for potions and for, like, sweet treats and plan your own party and, like, make party favors and that kind of thing. I am practicing my Spanish, which is why I've decided to read some children's chapter books in Spanish. And I think I will be continuing with this Mirabella series. So anyway, I'm really grateful for my library system for really allowing me access to this work in Spanish so that I can work on my own Spanish. The other thing that I just finished reading this morning, I am so happy to have read. I loved this. That was Free Rin Volume 12. At the end of Free Rin Volume 11, I was like, oh my god, I cannot wait to read the next one because of what happens at the end of Volume 11. I was like, holy shit, no way. Giddy. Kicking my feet. Kind of giddy. This did not disappoint. I had a great time. Oh yes, there were 2 other children's books that I have already given away. Las ruedas del autobús giran y giran, which is like the wheels on the bus go round and round, but in Spanish. So I did read that, learned some words in Spanish for that as well. And Hide and Snake by Keith Baker. I show some of the illustrations for this book in the haul. I would love to show them to you right now, but I did already give this book away. But I loved the illustrations in this book, and genuinely this book was really, really fun because it is this really colorful snake, and the whole concept is you're trying to find the snake in every illustration, and it's like a mess of things, and it's different things on each page. So like one's like a bunch of yarn, and one is like laundry, and then some of it's like gardening stuff. So it's really fun. I could just imagine how fun it would be with a kid as well. The next thing that I pick up, do we want to pick it out together? So I'm reading Orbital, which could vaguely be counted as a science fiction, but I'm kind of also interested in science fiction. I picked up a bunch of weird little plays the other day as well. I do get tempted by the new things that I bring into my library. So I'm tempted to pick up Painting Churches. I think this is what I'm gonna go with for right now. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for joining me. That's all I read for the month of February. I will be back in March. If you enjoyed this, please consider sharing it with a friend who you think would also enjoy it. Consider liking and subscribing, and I will be back again very soon.